Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion on ESG, what every financial leader needs to know. I'm Kathy Kilroy, an FEI sponsor, board member, and program committee chair for FEI's Career Management Group. I have a couple of announcements before we get started. Please put your name and email in the chat session. We'll be sharing the attendee list with you, as well as our panelist contact information. So you can go ahead and do that now. You can place yourself on mute for the presentation. You're welcome to keep your camera on, or you can turn it off for the presentation, whatever you're more comfortable with. Questions can be asked through the chat at the bottom of your screen. And FEI Chicago will be offering 1 CPE credit today for this meeting. You must attend the full session to get the credit. And then you request it by contacting Susan Gidley at FEI, and the email address is info@feichicago.org. Susan's information will also be in the chat. I want to welcome our guest to FEI and let you know that FEI is offering a free 6-month trial membership, which I encourage you to take advantage of. I'm a longtime member and sponsor of FEI and have developed so many wonderful friendships with FEI colleagues and learned so much in the process over the years. Our Chicago chapter is a very active and welcoming group. As an FEI member, you'll have the opportunity to connect with and build relationships with other financial leaders in Chicagoland and nationally to expand your network and benchmark best practices. You can participate in our live and virtual professional development forums to stay current and receive CPE credits. There are also a number of leadership opportunities on both the local and national level for you to participate in, which obviously is a career booster for those of you that want to get involved. We'd love to have you. You'll have online access to a robust network of national and local senior financial executives through the FEI portal as well. And you're welcome to share your membership with your teams. So please reach out to Susan to take advantage of the membership at the website. And, or if we can answer any questions, you can reach out. Well, ESG is certainly a hot topic. Over the past 2 years, environmental, social, and governance issues have undergone a major transformation. There's a passionate advocacy from employees and consumers, regulators, and NGOs. Companies and investors are diving deeper in evaluating their corporate impact and being held to higher standard of treatment of employees, and particularly around diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. So we're hearing a lot of buzz surrounding ESG. Your customers and communities are demanding it. The pressure on organizations to meet environmental, social, and governance criteria is more widespread than most financial leaders might realize. According to a recent Gartner report, 85% of investors considered ESG factors in their investments in 2020, and that number has increased and been on the rise ever since. In my work with C-level leaders in transition, I have certainly seen ESG questions coming up during the interview process. Leaders are being asked, how have you led or contributed to ESG initiatives? What impact have you made? So today, we're going to discuss why it's important to pay attention to ESG now and what you need to know as a financial leader. Before we get started, we'd like to hear from you and learn how advanced is your organization with ESG. So please take a moment and complete this poll. So, fledgling, okay, highest percentage. We have smallest percentage is those with advanced ESG practices or strategies in place. So we all have a lot to learn. I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists to you today. Here, Susan, I'm going to close, there we go. Katie Abbott, Managing Director of ESG at Solebury Trout. Dave Clauson, Director of Enterprise Risk Solutions at Forvis. And Amy Cline, Associate General Counsel, HCSC, the association that owns and manages Blue Cross of Illinois, Montana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. So be panelists, as we get started, I'd like you to start out, each one of you, by sharing your background and some company information and your role and involvement with ESG, please. Katie, can I start with you?
Of course. Thank you so much, Kathy. And it's so wonderful to be with you all today. I'll start with a quick introduction to Solebury Trout, and then I'll go into my background after that. So Solebury Trout, we are a wholly owned subsidiary of PNC Bank, and we are a boutique advisory firm, and we provide investor relations, corporate communications, and ESG support to both private and public companies across different industries. We also have a sister company, Solebury Capital, and they are a leading equity capital markets advisory firm. On the ESG team, we support our clients and mostly small to mid-cap clients that are relatively early in their ESG journey, so other companies that are fledgling, to build out robust ESG strategies. We help guide them on implementation and how to actually put the ESG strategies into practice, how to meet goals, how to set goals. We support companies on data collection and their disclosures and reporting. So not just putting out ESG reports and ESG websites, but also integrating ESG into SEC disclosures, into 10Ks and proxies. We also help companies understand their ESG ratings, so the MSCI, Sustainalytics ratings that they get as a public company. And then we also help companies engage their investors on ESG. And from my background, I have been in sustainability now for about 15 years. I started on more of the environmental side, working for the U.S. Green Building Council here in New York, where I should have mentioned that too. I'm based out of New York City. So I worked with Mayor Bloomberg's office on a number of initiatives around New York City. And I was really interested in international development and sustainability and also the more social side. So I then went to work for a women's cooperative based in Guatemala City. And from there, I studied international sustainable development at UC Berkeley. And it was during my master's program that I learned about sustainability consulting and became really interested in the opportunity to really drive business towards positive impact. So for the next 5 years, I worked for BSR, Business for Social Responsibility, a global sustainability consultancy firm, working both out of San Francisco with a lot of Fortune 500 tech companies on their sustainability strategies, and here back in New York, working for financial companies and fashion companies on their strategies. And now at Solebury, I've been here for about 1.5 years. So I've been building out our ESG advisory practice. And that's it.
Thank you. Very comprehensive. Love the background. Hopefully we can circle back later for, some of our younger attendees that are considering careers in this field. Would love to hear more. Dave, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're all well. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today. I think this is as Kathy said, it's a really hot topic, and I think it's one that we could really provide some clarity on. So my name is Dave Clauson. I'm a director with a company called Forvis. We're formerly known as BKD, but we just went through a corporate merger and transformation as of yesterday. So the new company name is Forvis. We're a tax advisory and an audit firm. I am personally based out of downtown Chicago, but our firm is headquartered in Springfield, Missouri. And I'm a director in our ESG and climate risk practice. And what we do is we assist our clients in creating ESG programs, everything from determining the potential materiality of issues, selecting frameworks, looking at reporting, they're creating reporting templates, cleaning data, the financial issues like setting up of internal controls and such to ensure the quality of their data. We also will do things like board education on ESG issues, diversity and equity and inclusion surveys, basically all those granular and large scale things which will help a company kind of determine what its ESG path needs to be and what its reporting is going to look like going forward. Personally, I come out of industry. I come out of operations as a former environmental health and safety guy. I was that person that used to run around talking about air quality and water quality and lockout tagout. From there, I kind of graduated into sustainability and then to ESG from there. So most of my experience is on oil and gas, mining and manufacturing, but been doing sustainability and ESG for quite some time now, and just came to help Forvis build and refine their practice. So again, thanks for the opportunity to speak today, and looking forward to kind of conveying some more information.
Thank you, Dave. Glad to have you. And Amy.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy Cline. I'm Associate General Counsel at Healthcare Service Corporation, or HCSC, which is the parent company for 5 Blue Cross Blue Shield plans, with Illinois and Texas being the 2 largest. I came from an international law firm background. I did that for about 10 years, and then I worked for a private equity-backed company. And now I'm at a private company that operates somewhat similarly to a publicly traded company. So I come from the background of saying that I didn't know much about ESG about a year and a half ago. I might have been able to tell you a little bit about what the E stood for, which was environmental, but I definitely couldn't have told you what social or G governance stood for. And so I think you'll find my portion of, the discussion interesting from the standpoint of learning about it a year and a half ago, why I think it's important, not just for your company, but also personally and professionally. And I'm thankful that you guys are giving me an opportunity to participate and share with you today.
Thanks, Amy. Great to have you with us. Now, before we jump into the discussion, we'd like to ask the audience again another poll question. So the question is, who has ownership for ESG in your organization? Susan's going to run the poll. So by far, other, meaning maybe no one or I don't know, came in highest. CFO at 23%. Okay. Great. All right. Well, thanks for that. So let's jump in and get to the heart of it. So what is ESG? We've all heard the terms corporate responsibility and sustainability. How do they all fit in together, or are they different? Okay, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure, I can start.
Read it off.
This is a question that we get quite often at Solebury, and we have companies coming to us saying, we focus on sustainability, thinking they just focus on the E issue. And a lot of companies use these terms differently, but generally we think they all are talking about the same topics, and they're often used interchangeably. So we encourage companies to say generally we're neutral to what term that you use. We have seen a trend more from corporate social responsibility to ESG. And especially in our world, which is very investor focused, ESG is the more common term and the term that's more on the rise. But broadly zooming out, when we think about sustainability, we're thinking about, the standard UN Brundtland definition of meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So that's kind of the framework that we're placing a lot of these efforts in. But when it comes to business and thinking about the E, S, and G, we're thinking about how to assess a company's governance mechanisms, so the G, and then their ability to manage their environmental and their social impacts. So within the environment, we're thinking, energy, climate change, water, all of those topics. Within social, human capital management, diversity, equity, inclusion, partly your supply chain, sustainability and labor issues. And then governance, that gets to your overall ESG governance, your board of directors, independence and diversity, your cybersecurity and privacy issues, and lots of other topics in between.
So how does DEI fit into all of this as well? Or, certainly we've seen such a push towards DE&I the last 2 years. It's always in the top 3 priorities, it seems, listed by leaders. And does that fit under the social piece of it then?
Absolutely. So we usually consider this a social topic, though there's a lot of leading companies that are also looking at the interaction of DEI and some of these other topics, especially DEI and environment, thinking about women in climate and kind of the overlap there of particular topics. But usually we think about DEI and building a really equitable place to work as part of your social criteria and what your employees are looking for, how to attract broader talent, but also thinking about DEI when it comes to customers, when it comes to your offerings, your products and services. So DEI can touch a lot of different elements of your business, but within the ESG and where you're really reporting out on it, it falls under the social topic.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Kathy, can I throw something in here?
Absolutely.
Yeah, hi, this is Amy. Well, Dr. Scott preempted me here because I was going to say that it's challenging for me to remember sometimes ESG, right? We've already said E stands for environmental, S is for social, and G is for governance. And I cannot take credit for this, but I have heard people refer to it as the 3 Ps, which is candidly easier for me to understand. So the 3 Ps are planet or environment, people or social, and purpose or profits equals governance. And that for me is a little bit easier to kind of think about. The one thing I would say about DEI is I do agree that it's in the social component of ESG, but I also think it can show up in the governance piece of it, particularly when you're talking about boards of directors and executives and their compensation. If you're, in an organization who really is taking ESG seriously, these kinds of issues are coming up right as part of the board agenda. They also are being tied to executive compensation and even in some cases, executive goals.
And why is it so important for organizations to pay attention to ESG now, or what's really propelled this?
I can jump in here, Kathy, at least as a start. There's a number of different drivers out there. I mean, what we're really seeing, I think the largest overall driver has been demographics. As the population is shifting, the baby boomers are getting older and dropping out of the workforce through retirement. A lot of the wealth transfer from the baby boomers is happening to Gen X and the millennial populations. And Gen X and the millennial populations are very much more used to demanding transparency from the organizations that they do business with and that they interact with. And so, that demand for transparency backed up by that massive wealth transfer is one of the biggest drivers out there right now. I think that's one of the reasons you've seen such a surge in interest and activity in the ESG space, even just over the last 2 or 3 years. That's at least, there's other significant drivers, but I think that would be, to me, that's kind of the main one that's pushing so much of this forward.
No, I so agree. And, people are putting comments in the chat, Gen C even more so, or Gen Z. And we certainly see that with young employees, right? Making decisions who to go to work for based on a lot of the policies and authenticity around these policies that organizations have in place. And Dave, what about from a regulations standpoint? Let's focus on some regulatory issues and what's driving ESG regulations currently.
Oh, this is the fun one that everybody wants to hear about because it's our favorite topic, right? What are our regulations forcing us into doing? So the Biden administration has really since the Biden administration came into office, they've really been taking a whole of government approach to pushing ESG. I mean, it seems like every different regulatory agency has been asked or mandated to implement some sort of climate, whether it be climate related reporting, climate awareness, some sort of climate related kind of activity. I mean, you're looking at everything from the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency to all these different leadership councils that have financial impact, and most notably the SEC. The SEC is they promulgated a rule back in March that said that publicly traded companies would have to implement significant amounts of kind of not only greenhouse gas emission estimations from their scope 1 all the way potentially to scope 3, but information about their climate risks and opportunities, their strategies. If somebody is planning on going to net zero, how are you going to do this? So that was the climate rule that the SEC just promulgated. That comment period is still open. It looks like I believe it's going to be open till the middle of June. So that's spurring a lot of activity kind of on on companies that are either publicly traded or potentially either do a lot of business with public companies or that may be looking at going public themselves. So there's a big impact there. And then, even last week, the SEC just rolled out another proposed rule where if you have ESG funds, whether you're potentially a fund manager or you run a fund yourself, and you say that you have ESG impact, or if it's an ESG fund, you're going to have to back that up. I mean, you can't just say, well, it's we consider ESG factors. They want to know exactly what that's going to look like. And, I think there's definitely going to be some teeth behind that. I mean, we've seen, talking about the SEC, enforcement has become a big issue with them. We just saw an enforcement action take place against Mellon for kind of ESG claims with their funds. We don't know what the ultimate upshot of that is going to be, but from a regulatory side, you can see they're promulgating all these draft rules. Enforcement is rolling right out behind it. So, in addition to that, the drivers of demographics and that kind of financial pressure that goes along with it, the regulatory side is coming right behind it. And it's, I think, something, whether you're a public company or you're a private company or some other sort of an organization, I think there are going to be either direct or kind of, second order effects on everybody. So it's definitely going to push change kind of for the entirety of the industry.
Wow. And how do you see that regulatory landscape changing over the next few years?
I think over the next few years, it's just going to, I frankly think it's just going to intensify. I mean, like I said, we've seen a whole of government approach so far. A lot of those different federal agencies are rolling out, especially climate related, guidance and recommendations and regulations. So I think over the next couple of years, that's just going to keep going. I mean, we'll see what the ultimate upshot of some of these rules are going to be. They still have to survive the rulemaking process, comment, and then potential litigation. But I think, no matter what happens, again, a rising tide is going to lift all the boats here. So I think what that's going to do is I think it's going to cause every organization to take a hard look at their ESG program and put something in place to prepare themselves for the eventuality of they're eventually going to need one.
Wow. Okay.
Kathy, can I throw in something too?
Yes,
Sorry.
Please jump in.
Well, I wanted just to throw out that I agree with everything that Dave is saying. A lot of this, is being generated by the federal regulatory agencies. And obviously, most of it at this point has to do with publicly traded companies. But I did just want to share something that came across my desk last week because I think you guys will find it interesting. While not exactly regulatory in nature, it has to do with the California court who just overturned a law in California that required companies who are headquartered in California to have a certain number of women on their board of directors. And it was like a tiered kind of thing. So if you had to have one woman on your board by the end of 2019, 2 women on your board if your board was 5 members or more by the end of 2020, and 3 women on your board if your board was 6 members or more by the end of 2021. And it was recently overturned by a California court saying that it was unconstitutional and it violated the right to equal treatment. So I throw that out there to say, I agree that there's a lot going on. There's a lot of regulation, but I think it's still very much up in the air as to kind of how all this is going to pan down. Because here's an example of a state who was trying to enforce a law to get more diverse representation on companies' boards of directors, and a judge just overruled it. So it'll be interesting to see if other states do similar things.
Thanks for sharing that, Amy. Absolutely. Katie, any further thoughts before we move on? Or
I would just add to that. I do think it's incredibly complex, and just the points that David shared where we see the regulations rising. We also see what's happening in Europe, and Europe has such stringent regulations. They have the EU taxonomy now and the SFDR, which require disclosures around ESG investment decisions. And generally, I would hope that that is the direction that the US is going in. And I think we see a lot of inspiration coming out of Europe. So I think it's very complex. I think, as Amy has pointed out, that there's pushback on some of the efforts to move us forward. But I think in general, companies need to be prepared, need to be watching this space, and need to be trying to get ahead of some of these regulations so that not only are they are prepared when they come their way, but also they are attracting their employees and customers, and all of those other drivers that we spoke about earlier. So
I think it would be of interest to a lot of our financial leaders to how do they keep up to date around all these compliance priorities or with multiple sets of standards coming from, global or national regulatory agencies?
Unfortunately, I wish there was one really good, one size fits all answer. Regulatory developments are it's notoriously hard to keep track of. For organizations that have systems in place, for example, like I said, I come out of the EHS world, environmental health and safety, and that's a similar environment where you have regulatory changes happening constantly, federal, state, local level. And there are subscription services out there that provide regulatory tracking in whatever area you're looking at, whether it be environmental, ESG, et cetera. Those are good services. Unfortunately, they tend to be kind of expensive. I think one of the best low cost ways that I've seen is frankly just find some of these agencies. A lot of these agencies have mailing lists. For example, like the SEC has a really robust mailing list where you can join, subscribe, and get information on whatever topic is useful to you. And you can do similar things through the different other regulatory agencies you're interested in. It's a nice low cost way for them to send you the information that you can keep up on. I mean, there's other higher tech ways of doing it, but that's at least a good starting point. But the difficulty is definitely there.
Okay, great. Thanks for that.
Kathy, can I add one more point there?
Yes.
In addition to regulations, you mentioned there's also a lot of different standards and frameworks, and the ESG frameworks, that is the alphabet soup situation that, a lot of companies are struggling to know which standards do I pay attention to? Do I pay attention to SASB, TCFD, and all of these others? Then again, you also have all of the ratings agencies. And it used to really be I would say a few years ago, more of a Wild West situation in terms of what is ESG and what is best practice. But we do see this major trend in ESG towards more data standardization and towards more of a consolidation of a lot of these frameworks. So I do think we are moving in a good direction where there is going to be increasing guidance for companies around what are the right steps to be taking.
Great. Well, and following up on that, and maybe let's shift gears a little bit and talk about best practices. And while we're doing that, friends, if you have specific regulatory questions or want to dive deeper on any of the things we've talked about, go ahead and put your questions in the chat. We're going to circle back at the end. I'm not going to take questions throughout the discussion. So throw your questions in the chat. Katie, so how should a company think about a formal ESG strategy versus an informal approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've seen a lot of companies kind of shifting from more of the informal, more of the risk management and compliance approach to being more strategic and more integrated across their companies and really thinking about ESG as an opportunity and more as a value creator. So we encourage companies to, especially as we already talked about some of those drivers around your customers, your employees, your investors is one that we didn't really touch too much on, but to really be prepared to communicate your efforts and to respond to all of these different stakeholder demands. It is really helpful for a company to have a more formal approach to an ESG strategy. And so for us, we help companies and we encourage them to think about what are their most material ESG issues. So there's a lot of topics out there that we touched on within that ESG umbrella. But what especially investors are expecting companies to do is to not address every single ESG topic under the sun, but to really think about the topics and assess the topics that are most important to their company and to their stakeholders. And so there are formal processes to do that. There's also standards that you could look at, such as the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB, to help you do that, and to really focus in and prioritize those topics that are most material to your company as a starting point.
Great. I think that's a great starting point, right? Who is ESG really serving from an organization standpoint? Is it customers, vendors, investors, et cetera, right? Start with the basics. Okay. And with so many ESG topics out there, do companies really need to address them all?
No, definitely not.
Good news.
Yeah, that's the good news. And it's also really important for companies to understand why they are addressing certain topics, and to understand what their impact is, what their potential for impact is, and address the ones that their employees care about, that their stakeholders, their communities, their investors care about, and the ones that are most material to their business operations, to their supply chains, and all of that. So absolutely, it's important to assess the topics that are core to their business.
And then prioritize within those on what to focus on first. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah, and if I can foot stomp something that Katie just said a moment ago, it's very important to select those things. I mean, you can always try and boil the ocean. ESG is a huge area, and you can always try and do too much. And that stakeholder input that Katie was just talking about is going to be really important, because that'll really help you determine not only what's important to your organization, what are those things that are material, but also, that also guides your reporting strategy. Who are you talking to? Why are you talking to them? What kind of report do you want to put out? And the reporting process and your ESG program kind of go hand in hand. They're very symbiotic. And so that input from your stakeholders is going to be super important. And then also the selection of your framework, whatever framework you go with, unfortunately, it's not an easy question to answer. What's my right framework? That takes some thinking, but the framework selection will really help you also determine, what some of those aspects you're going to want to concentrate on. So I think those things together really kind of help take what's a very big amorphous issue and kind of help, bring it a little bit, and help narrow that focus a little bit.
So I'm guessing that obviously boards of directors are very involved with organizations around the specific frameworks, or not.
And that depends. And I think that's one of the things that we see, in ESG, especially kind of on the governance side, is the involvement and the education of a board is very important, because these are the folks that make some of these big, long, high range decisions. And so board education is really important. Board involvement is very important. I think we've all been in those organizations where you get an initiative that comes in, and it starts out at the C-suite level, and then it gets automatically pushed down from a C-suite to the vice president to a director somewhere, and it ends up going nowhere. And so what I would advocate is that the ESG being as big a topic and important a topic as it stays at that very, very high level, like in the C-suite level, and and making sure that the board is very, very heavily tied in as what's going on.
Well, and I think that's why, from an interview standpoint, with a lot of our C-level leaders, that's why they're being asked these questions so frequently now, right? And some have had the opportunity to lead those kinds of initiatives, and others haven't, but they've really had to give serious thought to how they contribute or have contributed to those initiatives in order to position them effectively for their next leadership role.
Exactly.
I'd dovetail. Oh, sorry, Kathy. I would dovetail on that by telling a little story that might be helpful for folks. ESG can crop up in ways that you wouldn't think of. And a good example of that for me professionally was when the presidential elections were being certified. Several employees at my company had opinions about that certification process and expressed them, which on the one hand was really great, right? Because I had never seen employees be that open and honest before. But on the other hand, you may recall at the very beginning, I said we have Illinois and Texas. And so the opinions in Illinois about what was going on were a lot different than the opinions about what was going on in Texas. But the moral of the story is that, the company had to take that into consideration, right? And they were sort of scrambling because we don't technically have a formal ESG policy. And now we have to kind of address that. And we have to think about who are the politicians and candidates that we're giving political contributions to. And employees are paying attention to that. And they're looking at their voting record and they're seeing what they stand for. And now employees, I don't know if it's because of COVID or ESG or what, feel emboldened to give their opinions about that, which I think they should. So it's been a really interesting time. And it came up in a way that I would not have expected it to.
Great story. So when should a company start thinking about ESG?
2 years ago?
Yeah, go ahead, end it.
I think what's the old joke about, the best time was 2 years ago, the
Right.
second best time is now. I mean, all kidding aside, I mean, I think it's right now is the time where organizations really should start thinking about, what their formal and informal processes need to be. I mean, and if the first step would really be, kind of that gut check, what kind of an organization are we, what's important to us, what kind of a process, what kind of a program do we want to start, what's in our, really is in our DNA. Because like I said, some of those drivers, they're coming, whether it's the regulatory drivers for some of us, but those societal drivers, they're really going to come, and that the transparency that's being demanded of, from external stakeholders is that pressure is only going to increase. I think there's going to be all those
and downshift, right? From large public to mid-cap to private and nonprofit organizations as well. We're going to see that move very quickly.
Exactly.
We also see a lot of companies starting to think about ESG when they're preparing to go public. Mm-hmm. And we encourage companies to start early. So often companies, 2 months out, they say, oh no, we want to integrate ESG into our IPO and into our S1 and our story, but they haven't actually done anything. So to start an ESG strategy at least a year or so before you go public is a really good idea, to actually have a strategy that you can stand up and some efforts in place in advance of going public and in advance of facing the ratings that will launch within your first year of being public, your ESG ratings, and making sure that you have all of your public disclosures lined up, all of the policies in place that those ratings are going to be looking for.
Great, thanks for that, Katie. So what questions should financial leaders be asking to begin the conversation with their leadership teams if they haven't started to move forward with an ESG type framework or initiative?
Well, again, I think, one of the good starts would be, that kind of stakeholder analysis, like I said, the needs of the stakeholders, internal and external, is what really drives, what an ESG program and reporting looks like. So really kind of, what is leadership looking for? I guess one of the first questions I ask is, why are you doing this? And who are you talking to? Who is your audience? Because I think your ESG program and your report is going to look a little different if your main audience might be a board of directors. It's not externally facing, it's going to be internally facing. Or are you looking for something that can be publicly facing, that's going to go out on your website? Do you want something that's going to be appended into your 10K, or is this something that you want a glossy 40-page report with all sorts of infographics and photos that you can distribute? So, what's your DNA as a company? What do you want? What do your stakeholders want? What's the point of reporting? And that can be your starting point from there. And then you can use that to gauge the knowledge and your leadership, kind of where that education needs to be. And you can start, at least philosophically that's your philosophical starting point right there. And you can get more specific and start creating strategies and programs from there.
Great.
I think another important question related to both of those is, what is our ambition level and where do we want to be? But do we want to be an ESG leader out in front, or do we want to be keeping up with our peers and kind of middle of the pack? Or is our ambition really just to keep up with regulations and compliance? And being really honest about that ambition level and about the buy-in of your leadership is important before you jump into any ESG efforts, because if you don't have that buy-in and support and you kind of have a misalignment of the ambition level, that can be really challenging.
Are you able to share, not company names, but, even with clients, kind of general examples, maybe industry specific with some of the challenges, or maybe some of the, approach or framework with it that an industry, obviously oil and gas and some of these larger industries have had things in place for longer. I'd be curious, do you have any examples with mid-market companies that might be relevant or helpful for the group to know?
I'm not sure if this is quite getting at the question, but something that I wanted to bring up earlier when we were thinking about, companies not needing to address every material topic, every topic, but actually need to focus on their material topics. Another challenge that we're seeing with some companies is thinking that they already have a really great ESG strategy because they have a really great approach to philanthropy, or because they are inherently a company that is supporting the transition to sustainability. So we did have one client, for example, that had a really robust philanthropy program. They kind of had to give, like, for every sale they made, they gave away money to a foundation. So they already thought they were doing everything they had to do, but they did nothing about climate, nothing about governance. Even for their social and their human capital, they had nothing in place. So we really had to talk them through about, you need to understand all of the material issues. And then just as a really public example right now is Tesla. And Tesla has been in the news a lot lately for Elon Musk's comments on his perspectives on ESG. But Tesla, of course, is supporting the transition to a more sustainable future, and is so critical. But at the same time, they have a lot of issues around DEI and a lot of human capital issues that they're not addressing. And so you can't just address some material topics and not the others.
Great. You know, it's interesting. I think in the last 2 weeks, I read an article in Cranes that the Shed Aquarium is launching a $19 million ESG fund to support conservation. And it's funded by a Walmart heir, but they're looking at taking that, you know, well beyond the museum campus and well beyond the states and making that a global initiative as well. So that was, to me, that was interesting, you know, seeing it even move into that sector.
You know, it's an interesting point that Katie brings up that I meant to say earlier. You know, when we did our first poll question, we asked people to rate their company on ESG and whether it was fledgling, intermediate, I think advanced. I would say for my company, it depends on which piece of ESG we're talking about. So Katie was talking about a foundation and, you know, doing really well as far as the community. So for me, the community piece of it would be intermediate or advanced, but there might be another aspect of social or environmental or, you know, governance that we're fledgling on. So I'm not sure that you can say 100% that a company is either fledgling, intermediate, or, you know, advanced. I think different pieces of ESG may be at different stages of the policy making, if that makes sense.
Great point, Amy. Makes total sense.
Yeah, if you're looking at it from like a maturity model perspective, you're not necessarily going to be skilled at everything, but you know, there's different areas where you can be, you know, you could excel, you know, whether it's in a technical area or whether it's in, you know, might be very good at communications, but you're not necessarily very good on, you know, internal controls. So I think the upshot is, you know, not everybody's going to be perfect, but, you know, start with the things that you are good at, the data that you have, and build from there. Like build from a strong foundation, and you know, once you have that set, then you can build outwards from there.
Dave, do you have to have special systems in place for gathering, for reporting, you know, or is there software? We didn't talk about this earlier. I just came to mind when you said that.
Yeah, there are. I mean, as you can probably imagine, there's a million different software systems out there, cloud-based systems, and there's specific niche ones. There's, you know, broad service providers, and the market's just exploding these days. There's the companies who are the big, you know, kind of the 800-pound gorillas, and then there are kind of the ones that are kind of coming up in behind. So a lot of the providers are kind of working on building out their ESG offerings right now. I would say it's really dependent on your organization, because everybody, you know, people look at technology as a silver bullet. We get the right system, it'll, you know, we'll fix all that ails us. And a system is only as good as your organization, for example. So for example, if you want to put in a system, you have to look at who do you want to use it? You know, what's the skill level and the technology level of your user base? You know, if you want to put in a big fancy system and the people that are using it aren't used to fancy systems, you know, you're wasting time, you know, you're burning daylight, you're wasting time and effort. So systems can help, but I really, you know, I think if you're looking at a system, you really have to take a very strong look at what your needs are and what the offerings are out there. It takes some time and effort. You can find something that helps, but I've seen effective ESG programs, you know, especially for kind of the smaller mid-market companies that are still run by, you know, database and spreadsheet and are still effective. So it really depends on, you know, your skill level, your technology level, you know, how much, the comment was made earlier, you know, how much of a leader do you want to be and how much do you want to devote to this? So those are all questions to answer. And I think the technology should be kind of the trailing answer rather than, you know, the thing that you really want to lead with.
Yeah. Technology is the tool, not the process.
And unfortunately, it does tend to get looked at as the process. As the savior. And it's, I mean, there's a lot of people who get burned by looking at it that way.
I really strongly agree with that point that there is no silver bullet in terms of the data management systems, and integrating ESG into your current systems is so critical instead of trying to create brand new and separating ESG into its own system of management, but instead thinking about how do we already manage data and how can this be an add-on and a part of what we already do in our day-to-day is really important.
Great, thanks. Well, let's shift gears and look at the individual a little bit. So Amy, can you tell us what an ESG mindset is and why developing that mindset is so important, both personally and professionally for all of us?
Yeah, sure. Well, I would say a mindset, in general is defined as a set of attitudes that a person has. And the ESG mindset is one that we should be developing for several reasons. One reason is because it's the right thing to do, right? I mean, at the end of the day, all the things that we're talking about is the right thing to do. But you may still be wondering, kind of why should I care about this? And I think professionally, it's important if you want to enhance your leadership profile. If you take on ESG or you're involved in a group at your organization who is, saying that the company should move forward with ESG, I think that differentiates you from other people out in the industry. If at some point in the future you want to interview for another chief financial officer role, or you want to interview for a board of directors role, you're going to get questions about this. I've actually been in interviews where they have asked questions such as, how have you been involved in ESG? What's your role been? If you were to come to our company, what would you suggest doing from an ESG perspective? So knowing about ESG, being prepared to answer those questions and kind of thinking through that, and also having the experience would be really helpful and also make you stand out from other candidates, either for a CFO position or at a board of directors. The other thing
and researching the organization, right, to know what their footprint is around ESG before you even go in for the interview. That's great, Amy.
Oh, totally agree. And I mean, the other thing I would say is, we've talked a lot about the ESG mindset from the government regulatory perspective, which, right, they're looking at public policy and trying to protect the public. From the company perspective, in terms of making sure that the company is doing what it should be doing. And, studies have shown that companies that do implement ESG initiatives, they make more money. Not only is it the right thing to do, but they make more money when they have an ESG policy and they're following their ESG initiatives. But another kind of, more practical thing to be thinking about, I think Katie mentioned earlier, IPOs, is also if you are thinking about acquiring a company, or if your company is thinking about, potentially getting sold, these kinds of questions are coming up as part of the diligence process. These kinds of questions actually even come up at a company perspective in an RFP, like suppliers or vendors, when they're submitting, RFP questionnaires, there can be a couple questions on, do you have an ESG policy? What is it? What's the data surrounding it? And that kind of thing. But for me personally, I feel like it's the right thing to do. And also I think it's very, interesting. I mentioned earlier the story about employees. I like the fact that employees are feeling empowered to speak up. And for me, personally, I just think this is the right thing to do. But professionally, I also think, it raises your leadership profile and it makes you stand out from other people, because as we talked about at the very beginning, a lot of people still don't know what ESG means.
Right. Well, and following on that comment, let me take a question Jen put in the chat, and her question is in line with the importance of these issues to Gen X and millennials and Gen Z. What recommendations would you give in terms of targeting organizations with strong ESG programs and initiatives? How do you do that when you're searching for employment? And then on the flip side, how would you recommend organizations advertise their efforts and make them known? Any thoughts around that?
I'll try and take those maybe in reverse order. For an organization to how does an organization advertise that? Like I said, we talked about transparency a couple times during the course of this talk, and the best way to demonstrate transparency is to actively communicate that information. Whatever your ESG program is, or whatever stage you're in, make it public facing. If that's something that fits in the DNA of your organization, make it public facing. Websites, put it out there where people can see it and advertise it, because that's something that really does get job seekers in the public's attention. There's a danger of greenwashing. You don't want to go too far, but be honest about where you are in your journey, because people understand that. Even if you're just a fledgling and you're just starting out, communicate that. And I think your stakeholders and the public appreciate that honesty. On the flip side, like if you're doing a job search, I would say target, what's the industry you're looking at getting into. And then frankly, Google is our best friend out there in the world. Like, if you look at, best ESG performers in a particular industry, the SEO the SEO that's out there, you'll find those things in a heartbeat. And you'll be able to look at those reports and gut check them and see the companies that are really, they do have a strong program, or they really have some devotion to it, or are they just kind of talking the talk?
So, Dave, let me ask you, you used the term greenwashing, and I just literally heard that term a couple weeks ago. Can you explain that for the audience, please?
Sure. I mean, it comes out of the sustainability world, and it's essentially kind of I would call it almost like puffery. Okay. When a company has a sustainability CSR ESG program, and they put out a big fancy report, lots of infographics, lots of pictures, and then when you start looking behind the scenes, there's really not a whole lot of meat on those bones. It's enough to make yourself look better in the eyes of the public. And on the greenwashing front, this just occurred, I think, yesterday. And forgive me if I'm incorrect at all, but I believe over in Germany, there was a bank, I believe it was Deutsche Bank, that was actually just raided yesterday because their investment arm made claims of, they made some claims about their ESG practices and their investments, and they were raided by the police to get more information. So, I mean, we're not at that place here in the United States yet, but I mean, you can tell at least in the EU that they're taking it very seriously, and it's something that you don't want to do that. Like I said, being honest about what your program is, even if it's just kind of starting out and you're just at your basics, because people understand that they want to see honesty more than they want to see a big fancy report with lots of glossy pictures and such. Great point.
This is a more technical question that came in. Given the SEC proposal on climate-related disclosures, how are companies thinking through controls surrounding greenhouse gas disclosures that will eventually require a reasonable assurance from auditors?
That's the $64 million question right there. I mean, and coming out of industry, I'll say it like this. A lot of the information that historically has gone into a sustainability report or a CSR report, whatever have you, a lot of it is operational data. You're talking natural gas use, electricity use, material throughputs, things that come out of the operations of your company. And most companies are not used to having controls over operational data. You go to your operations guys and you say, all right, what assurances can you tell me that we're getting the right amounts of our natural gas use on this website, and those controls, what are you talking about? So the thing that companies and organizations are really going to have to learn through this process of ESG is taking what they know about internal controls from financial management, being able to, audit trails and being able to ensure that you've got really robust and trustable data. They're going to have to kind of copy and paste those same kinds of processes over from kind of the financial realm, because we're all used to it with proxy statements, 10Ks, public reporting. It's a skill set that I think probably a lot of the folks on this call have, and be able to kind of make that kind of analogous control scheme in your operational data as well. And HRIS systems, and it's going to have to apply to other places where I think people haven't necessarily thought about it before.
So another technical question is, if companies are considering bringing this process into scope for SOX purposes, what about disclosure requirements being amounts exceeding 1% of the financial statement line item threshold that is in the current SEC proposal? That's way too tech for me, but you guys can handle it.
I can at least, I guess, start on that one, and I'll
Okay.
start with the caveat that I am not a CPA. I'm an engineer, so this is where I'm a little over my skis. But it's a tough threshold for materiality right there. I mean, it really is, and so the upshot is it's going to have organizations do a lot more reporting than they think they may have had to in the past, and it's really going to have to, organizations are really going to have to examine what they consider to be material. Because 1% is a low threshold, and some of the other requirements that are out there, especially in the SEC, proposed rule, looking at things like, are these the kinds of, is it material? Are these the things that are going to cause an investor to potentially make a different decision? Well, there's definitely going to be some interpretation, some wiggle room there, but yeah, the 1% limits are going to, I think companies and organizations are going to have to take a hard look at that, because it's going to force a lot more transparency than I think they've been used to in the past.
Great, thank you. Even I certainly want to thank our panel for sharing your time and your insights with us today. It's been so helpful, and certainly a lot of great takeaways for all of us as we move forward in this process and what we need to do in our organizations. A couple of reminders, FEI is hosting peer networking breakfast in Chicago on June 22nd. Dan McHugh will be hosting that, and on Deerfield on June 24th. So these are small group meetings that are great opportunities to meet FEI members and sponsors, and you guests that are on the phone, you're welcome to come out and join us and get acquainted with the group. So you can find out more about those events on the FEI website. And our annual golf outing, which is always sold out. So if you're interested, sign up early. It'll be held on August 19th at White Deer Run. And there are sponsorship opportunities available for those of you interested in that. And last but not least, I want to encourage our guests to take advantage of the free 6-month trial membership. You can reach out to Susan at admin@feichicago.org to take advantage of the offer. If I can answer any of your questions about membership or introduce you to other FEI board members and sponsors, let me know. I'm always happy to do so. And last but not least, we'll be sending a program evaluation out to you, as well as all the participant lists today. And we really are eager for your feedback. It's about 3 minutes, so please take the opportunity and time to complete it. And thank you all for attending. It's been great seeing you, and I look forward to seeing you at upcoming events, and have a wonderful summer.